seats. And I also have a few thank yous to give. And I also have to point out the fire exits. Toilets are nearby. If I could ask you to switch your phones off and put them on silent, that would be much appreciated. Young Arab Voices is a program which launched in the spring of 2011 with substantial, generous funding from the UK Foreign Office to support youth debate programs, initially in Tunisia, Jordan, and Egypt. The program has since expanded into Morocco, Libya, and I believe Algeria as well, and is attracting ongoing support and other partners who are interested in supporting the program. It's become, if I'm not mistaken, in the last year or so, the leading youth debate activity in Egypt. It's successfully penetrated beyond universities and English language speaking high schools into Upper Egypt, into villages, into community associations, women's groups, and those kinds of things where formal debate has not traditionally been available and practiced. So it's had a lot of successes, and we're very, very optimistic that it will continue to do so. As I say, you can find out more in the pack. The program is run jointly by the MLN Foundation, by the British Council. My thanks to the British Council, MLN Foundation. If we have representatives from the Foreign Office here, very much thanking them as well. I also want to thank King's College London for offering to host this event this evening, and providing the catering, refreshments and hospitality. And I want to thank International Debate Education Association, IDEA, in the UK, who's supporting this event with generous training and input to support the speakers and the development of the event you're going to see this evening. So a great debt of thanks to all those partners who supported this program so strongly. I'm going to finally introduce to you various people who you're going to hear from in the course of this evening, and then we'll get on with proceedings. First, if I could introduce and thank Dr. Leila Simona Solani from the Department of European Studies and International Relations here at King's. Dr. Solani will be moderating the debate. I'd also like to introduce our colleague, Dr. Roberto Rocco, also from the same department here at King's, who will be speaking to you shortly about the background context to the motion that we have this evening. I'd like to present our debate speakers. We have here James Whitehouse Hebburn, Victor Prulya, and over on the far side we have Srishti Krishnamurti, who are all London-based debaters who work with IDEA in the UK. But I want to offer a special thanks to our three visitors from the North Africa and the MENA region who've come over to take part in this activity, who've been participating in the Young Arab Voices debate program in Egypt and in Jordan. From the far end, I'd like to present Rahaf Mohammed, who's come from Oman in Jordan. I'd like to introduce Dalia Omar, who's come from Cairo in Egypt. And I'd like to introduce Mona Ibrahim, also from Cairo in Egypt, who've all come to take part in the debate this evening. If you give them a very, very warm welcome, that would be nice. You'll also be hearing in a little while from Alexander Cavell of IDEA, who is going to explain something to you about the format for the formal debate proceedings. After the formal debate, there will be an opportunity to have a wider question and answer session where you can ask the panelists questions about things which didn't come up in the debate, and where they will have an opportunity to talk about their experiences in Egypt and in Jordan and social change and social transformation, and to talk about things again which were not featured heavily in the debate. But I'd like to introduce first Roberto Rocco and ask Roberto to come up and provide us a short background context around the motion. What we tried to do with the motion was to contrast the need for economic development against the need for developing human rights, democracy, and the institutions surrounding that. We're not trying to say that this has to be an either-or suggestion or an either-or proposition, but I don't want to say any more because that's the debate, is to present the different arguments. But Roberto, please, if you could talk a little bit about the background context in which this debate's happening, I'd be very grateful. Thank you. Absolutely.
Thanks very much, Richard, for inviting us to participate to this great event. Thanks to all the institutions that are sponsoring the Young Arab Voices program, and to IDEA for providing much needed even training for the debate. In 3 weeks from now, it will be 2 years since Mohamed Bouazizi set himself to fire in Sidi Bouzid in Tunisia. And since then it has become almost common sense to say that nothing has stayed the same in the Middle East, and that the aura of immutability that the region had had for the previous 2-3 decades fell apart and proved to be, again, much more a facade than a reality. This involves both countries that have seen mass upheavals and the overthrow of their autocrats. But it has also involved countries where reforms have been carried out over the past couple of years, mostly from above. Cases such as Jordan, for example, or Morocco, that are very much outside of the spotlight, but still have had a sort of spillover effect from the Arab uprisings. Of course, political transformations, such as the ones that are characterizing the regions right now, also bring economic concerns with them. This is particularly true for the countries where people took to the streets and the economy was effectively shut down for weeks with the stock exchanges closing down, banks closing down, of course, foreign investment being withdrawn, and clearly economic consequences with respect to what comes next once the autocrat is overthrown. It is ironic, but at the same time, I believe it is not at all a coincidence that the countries where it all kicked off, so Tunisia and Egypt, were until even late 2008, and in the case of Tunisia, 2010, effectively considered both by the International Monetary Fund and by the World Bank to be successful cases of economic reforms. In the case of Egypt, the economists called around the end of the 1990s Egypt the IMF model pupil. Between 2004 and 2008, Egypt was for 4 years out of 5 among the top 10 reformers listed by the World Bank. And for what concerns Tunisia, I copied down here a quote directly from an IMF report saying that over the last 2 decades, Tunisia has carried out a wide-ranging reform program based on improving competitiveness of the economy, enhancing the business environment, and trade openness. This from 2010, a few months before everything started in Tunisia. So, economic reforms were proceeding well? Not really. The problem in this respect was that for probably a bit too long, economic development had been equated with economic growth. They had been effectively conflated. And if you saw things from the yardstick of economic growth, both Egypt and Tunisia were successful. In 2008, the Egyptian economy grew by 7.3%, which is something that for Western economies is just unthinkable. So, clearly, development and growth, we came to learn, are not synonyms. And this came very strongly in these countries, particularly when the global food crisis hit them. Particularly the rise in the prices of some staple goods, wheat particularly, showed how these economic reforms, whereas they brought, on the one hand, great economic growth, on the other hand, they also bred unprecedented economic inequality in these countries. Unprecedented economic inequality that we can see particularly when the revolts start. If you remember, one of the main mottos of the Arab Springs, particularly in Tahrir Square, was Aish Kerama Adala Ijtimaiya, which means bread, dignity, social justice. And as Mona and Dalia were telling us, this is exactly the call that Egyptians are making on the streets of Cairo today. And this is something that is very important for what concerns economic development in the new Middle East. Because these are demands for bread, demands for dignity, demands for social justice, that the governments in transition will not be able to avoid as the previous authoritarian governments did. So the new development of the Middle East will have to take into account these demands for bread, so reducing poverty, these demands for dignity, so trying to keep income distribution at a relatively even level, and for social justice again. So I guess this is enough of a background, and I wish all of our debaters what I'm sure will be a fruitful discussion and a conversation among us.
Thank you very much for a fascinating and stimulating comment, especially this debate is going to be going on as we speak in Cairo work on feedback around the future. I'd like to invite Kamal from IDEA now to talk to you a little bit about the format of the debate and the proceedings that are going to unfold. As I say, afterwards there's a question and answer session which will be less formal, and afterwards you will see there are refreshments and you can get involved in publicity and so forth. And one final thing which, as all bureaucrats do, I will kindly ask you to draw your attention to the evaluation form in your audience pack and ask you very kindly to fill those in during the event. Thanks very much. Alexander.
Okay, so this debate is going to be following a rule set that some of you may be familiar with and some of you may not be. What we're going to be using is a slightly altered version of what's called British parliamentary rules. It sounds more complicated than it is. It's really very simple. So we're going to start with a proposing side, what we call the government side. The first speaker on government side is known as the Prime Minister. They're going to give you a basic outline of the case. They're going to define any potentially uncontentious terms in the motion for you and give you an argument that's going to propel the case forward. Then we switch to the first speaker on the opposing side, the leader of the opposition, and they're going to do exactly what the name implies. They're going to be setting out why they stand against this particular belief, why they think it isn't true that states in transition should prioritize economic development above the development of democratic norms. And then we alternate back and forth between proposing or government side and opposition side speakers. So we'll move back round to the second government speaker after Dalia's speech is finished. That will be Prillia. That will be Victor Prillia. And then we'll move back across the table to Srishti. The final two speakers are summary speakers. There's one rule that applies to summary speeches, which is that they can't introduce new arguments. The summary speakers are here to provide you with an overview of the arguments deployed by their team and to compare and contrast them with the arguments of their opponents. Now, some of you may be familiar with forms of the British parliamentary rule set that allow speakers to interrupt, but we're not going to be using those interjections in this particular debate. Instead, all of the speakers have to commit in their speeches to making rebuttal points, so to replying to the arguments made by the speaker preceding them. That is essentially it for the rules that we're going to be using. Moderation will be provided by Leah, and the timing of the speeches will be 5 minutes. And without any further delay, I will pass you over to our chair, who will call the speakers and also be taking a floor vote.
Debate, which is the public debate motion is: this House believes that states in transition should prioritize economic development over the promotion of democratic norms and institutions. Now we'll have a floor vote. Any one of you who is in favor of this motion should put the hands up. Anyone who is against? We have 1, 2, 3, and 4, and well, I do again. Who is in favor? Up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The minority, clearly the minority. Who is against? Clearly the majority. Let's see what happens at the end of the debate. And we start with it. We'll give the floor to the Prime Minister, the proposition side, Mona Ibrahim from Egypt.
We, the government, believe that economic reform is more important than enhancement of democratic norms and institutions in the country of transition. Before we proceed to interpret our reasons, we should first define some terminologies: the countries of transition and economic development. First, countries in transition are the countries that were formerly subject to authoritarian regimes and are facing sudden growth in political parties and economic problems. Economic development is the development in the living standards and basic needs in regards to health, income, and physical security, education, and food supplies. Putting into consideration that these needs vary from one country to another. For example, if we look at Egypt, we could see that Egypt needs more concern about its income and health, while Libya needs more focus on its education and health aspect. From our definition of economic development, we could see that people in Arab Spring countries need infrastructure regarding better education, income, health, and other basic needs. People need to feel they are human beings. They need to feel they are living. For example, if you could look at the revolution in Egypt, people asked for bread, freedom, and bread, freedom, and social justice, which are mainly economic demands. People demands would take too long if we pass it through political changes and legal decision making. People need to feel change in their daily basis, or else we would watch them suffer and starve. As we could see now, people are still protesting, asking for the same economic demands. They are asking for their income to be equality in their income, and for the food to be guaranteed. If President Morsi would have taken firm decision, economic decision, there wouldn't have been these consistent protests. Sometimes starting with democratic transition is a good starting point, but in the Arab Spring case, it's not. As we can see, in Tunisia and Egypt, again, people asked for economic demands. And as we can see in Egypt, more than 40% of poverty in Egypt. How could we ignore that? How could we ignore the fact that people are suffering every day for food and for places to live in? What kind of government could ignore that? We are not the kind of government who could ignore that. For any political system to work and maintain sustainability, it doesn't have to be democratic. It has to be coherent, meaning that the decisions of the government has to be met with the demands of the people, or else we could have a fragile political system. If we could look at the Chinese example, we could find that China is not a democratic state, but yet, have we seen any revolution from 1980, from their economic development starting point? No. Why? Because people need their political system to fulfill their demands. They need them to fill the gap of their needs. And that's why there was no protest and revolution against the Chinese government. If economic development is not the right step to start with, the Asian tigers would have failed. And again, if President Morsi would have taken economic steps and decisions, there wouldn't have been this protest and this instability in the country. Our point is, democracy is a vital need for any country, especially in the countries of transition. But we still can't build our own democracy when we are dependent economically. We don't want our policies, our regimes, to be externally dependent. We want to build our own economy in order to be able to build our own democracy. We could see an example for countries' interference 8 years ago, while in Bush presidency. African countries received financial aid on health issues, including family, women issues, but under the condition that it doesn't tackle the abortion subject, which entails how USA was controlling health and social policies in Africa. We could also see that in some developing countries, when developed countries give them financial aid, claiming that they are enhancing their military forces, while constantly monitoring how those grants are being spent, making sure that they have a clear understanding of their military capabilities, and threatening to withdraw this support if these countries turn away of their interests. Thus, we could find that the quality of democracy will be less representative of the people if an outsider is controlling it. Last, we could look at worst-case scenarios of starting with democracy, or either we will watch people starve, die, suffer from illness and hunger, or we could go back to authoritarian regime. And if we have to choose between democratic transition and economic development, we wouldn't have choose to watch people starving and dying from illness and hunger. We would choose to build our economy through building our own, to build our country through building our own economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister or Miss Prime Minister. And we now move to the opposition leader, Estalia Omar, always familiar.
Ladies and gentlemen, this House not only believes that economic reforms are important, but also that political reforms are more important for countries in transition. Political reform procedures should always be a step ahead. If we take a look at the example of Egypt, we will find that the demands of people are mainly bread, freedom, social justice. Only the first demand is bread, but the second two demands, which are freedom and social justice, will be achieved through real democratic policy reform. I cannot deny that people have basic needs. They need food, water, proper education, proper health care, infrastructure, security, and so on. But what will guarantee that through economic reform policies and that if the governments have money and has enough financial resources, this money will be fairly and properly directed to provide people with what they need? What will guarantee that people's voices are heard and that governments really care about solving their problems? If countries in transition don't take serious actions toward establishing the right and strong basis for democracy, nothing of these can be guaranteed. The absence of a strong democratic system leads to continuous ministerial shufflings. Each new government has its own plans and visions about economic development and will start its own projects, which is a huge waste of money and labor force that will hold back economic progress. Democratic mechanisms can guarantee consistency, and that no matter the government or the ruler in charge, the economic reform plans will continue to be achieved. Egypt have been through this before. If we go back to the 18th century, Sultan Muhammad Ali Pasha had a wonderful dream of building a strong, modernized, civilized Egypt. He did massive and dramatic economic reform, built a really strong army, but because he didn't build a strong political system to maintain his achievements, nothing remained after he was gone. Also, after the 1952 revolution in Egypt, Nasser took serious economic reform actions, but no serious political reform actions towards establishing a democratic system and engaging all parties in the political life, which consequently leads to deterioration of the political process through the two consecutive ruling periods of Sadat and Mubarak that ends with the 2011 revolution. If societies do not have self-correcting and self-developing mechanisms, they will suffer the consequences of corruption. Corruption will hold back any economic reform progress. Let us not forget here that the existence of corrupted regimes in Arab Spring countries was one of the main reasons why revolutions took off in the first place. For example, in Egypt, government has been trying to attract investors and encouraging them through offering them facilities and guarantees. But investors are hesitating as they know that corruption is a great threat to their investment. They know that they have to pay bribes to officers in order to get their job done. Also in Egypt, the corrupted regime leads to nepotism. So you can see that most of the critical governmental positions are not assigned to the most capable persons, but to those in favor of the regime. Persons close to the ruling family members to ensure their loyalty and obedience. If there are no right democratic mechanisms that guarantee that no particular person or party will monopolize authority and power, then people in charge won't feel like they need to change their policies, as they know that no one can judge their performance. The Transparency is a very important outcome of democracy, which is a very important tool for evaluating government performance and ensuring that the revenue from economic reform procedure will be spent on improving the quality of services provided to the people, and that it doesn't go into the pockets of those close to the rulers. So taking the right steps towards establishing a democratic system will enhance the ability of government to fight corruption. Focusing on the political reform and re-establishing the institutions on democratic basis that respect human rights and not on oppressive basis really boosts the ability of governments to achieve a secure environment. And in Arab Spring countries, when the old oppressive regimes fell, the police forces established to protect these regimes, not the people, fell too. And with people still protesting after 2 years of the revolution, mainly because they cannot feel any progress on the political reform side, this creates a very fertile soil for chaos. Lives and public properties are endangered. Finally, I want to say that in Arab Spring countries, people have been waiting for so long to retrieve their rights, and they won't give up these rights easily. They will refuse to return back as puppets in the hands of their governors. Now they have the right to decide, and they should. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much to the leader of the opposition, and then we have the response from the Deputy Prime Minister, Victor Piglia from the University of Belgrade.
We are not against democracy as the opposition necessarily fears. We in fact hope that democracy once will be installed in all of the countries that have successfully fought off the dictators that have gripped these countries for a very long time. However, we think that bread, in fact, was the main tool of oppression for all these regimes. And we in fact think that the first thing we need to do is make sure that the people of these countries, countries such as Lebanon, Tunisia, and Egypt, in fact have the basic sustenance so they can engage in nation building. That is, that they need to build democratic institutions, they need to make elections valid, but all of these things take time. Now, we think that if you look at Egypt as an example, a country that has went from dictator to dictator since the Second World War, we have from Abdel Nasser, Anwar al-Sadat to Hosni Mubarak. All of these autocrats actually controlled the majority of their people because they made people's welfare and prosperity dependent on the state. They in fact use bread as a weapon. This is precise we as the new government of these countries would propose to make people more economically independent, so then they can start the political dialogue that is necessary to build a civil society. Now, the main problem that we have is that we do not hate democracy, but we think democracy takes a very long time. The opposition notices in a very good good moment that they said you need transparency to be able to control government. But building a transparent media is something that takes a very long time, and we believe that Egypt has long been ruled by state-controlled media. In fact, we've seen that the revolution was actually dependent on Facebook and Twitter to have its message heard across. This is why we believe that such media in the future will take time. Also, one day hoping that these communities will have more civil liberties, that we will have more equality between men and women, that women will not be second-rate citizens. But this will require changing the entire mindset of a nation, which takes years of debate and discussion. In the meantime, there are people whose lives are at risk because of the abject poverty that they live in. We also believe that these people also have not only are they suffering in these periods, but also have a tendency to find scapegoats. This is why we believe that the primary issue of the state should be to build up the nation economically, to make sure that people can have jobs, to make sure that people can find employment, sustenance, and finally have their dignity. We also believe that by extending the economic hand to peoples who not necessarily live in Cairo, but rather live in places we haven't heard of, that are far away from the state, that are not connected to it, by actually getting state help to those people, such as subsidies to farmers, you can have their inclusion into the government. But first of all, I think two main points I would like to bring on side government. One is that Egyptians need something tangible. We have protests, mass protests, and millions of people still mobilized 3 years after the revolution has started. Why? Because nothing so far has happened that can tell them that the regime is different than Hosni Mubarak. Nothing tangible has happened to make the people's lives better. We think that to make future improvements, you need a stable government. And the only way to have a stable government is to start giving something tangible to the people. Currently, Egypt, for example, is very close to mob rule because you have so many young people mobilized and ready to do something about and are ready and able to change the government. We think, okay, let's have the government finally show that it is ready to give up on the massive wealth it has accumulated during the years of the dictators. This is why we believe can be shown through economic development of the country. But second of all, we find it very problematic that people are, that elections can be won and that people can be influenced through bread. If the people of Egypt or Tunisia or other Arab Spring countries are in such abject poverty that whether or not you feed them is going to get you elected for your next election, we believe that then you have a flawed democracy and then that the government in power can easily go down the dictator path that previous governments had went before. Second of all, we find that the fact that there is so much discontent between the people of these countries and the fact that they're very angry also creates danger for other groups in these countries. Many times when abject poverty shows, often people find scapegoats because they're mad and because they're hungry. And we've seen that huge pogroms that were done toward Coptic Christians in Egypt. We've seen that there's huge rise in militant Islamism. We also think that these things pose much greater threats to future democracies of these countries than anything else. These are the reasons why we believe it is necessary to start building up enough living standards that people can actually have money and time to send their children to school, to educate themselves, and then engage in a very arduous, a long task of creating these democratic institutions that will come through free media, debate, and discussion. However, we have a burning issue right now that needs to be addressed. That's why we believe you should vote for proposition.
Thank you to the Deputy of the Deputy Prime Minister, and we move to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Mrs. Srishti Krishnamurthy from the University of London.
The great delights of being short. Is my voice being caught on the mic? Yeah, cool. Okay, thank you, Madam Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk to you about two important things today. One, the very tangible social benefits that we already see the very tangible social benefits of establishing democratic norms that we see on our side of the house. And secondly, because the government is so concerned about the sort of economic disadvantages that are going to suddenly sort of appear, on the horizon, if we prioritize democracy, I'm going to also show you how the establishment of democratic institutions and norms actually have economic benefits. But before I do so, I'd like to engage with a couple of arguments that the previous speaker made. Now, first of all, when Victor tells us that we are not against democracy, but we think economic decisions should be prioritized at this moment. Now, we sort of have a bit of a problem, right? Because all of the arguments that they are building have to do with the fact that people have issues of basic sustenance that need to be met. Well, we do think that even if you prioritize sort of democratic norms, people are suddenly not going to sort of plunge into abject starvation. We do think that certain minimum economic sort of rights can still be maintained, but we believe that there are very significant advantages on our side of the house when we do establish democratic institutions. Secondly, he talked about how democracies, democratic decision making and sort of the advantages of democracies is a very slow process. So, for instance, things such as gender rights and debate and dialogue take a very long time. Now, what is particularly key to this debate is the fact that we're not talking about just any state. We're talking about states in transition. And as the Prime Minister defined the motion, we're talking about states that are moving from a situation of autocracy to a situation of finally having some political articulation, to finally having a difference of opinion. We believe that if at this moment, we fail to capitalize on this very particular political import of the situation, which is to say that this is finally the moment when we can actually prioritize democracy, we think that nothing will be achieved, that the very situation that we are talking about is going to be further harmed if we do not take into consideration the fact that this is possibly the moment when all these sort of grassroots level changes that the government is talking about can be made, will have to be made. We think that, yes, we do agree that democratic sort of norms take a long time coming, that there needs to be, you know, a long-term debate and discussion for, minority rights and women's rights and things like that. But we believe this is perhaps the best time to start doing it, because we are specifically talking about a moment when we're moving away from autocracy towards alternate political articulation. Secondly, I think the sort of one of the arguments that was implicit in Victor's speech was the fact that people will feel more involved with the state if there is actually, if the state is actually able to show that they are making an economic investment in the lives of their people. We believe that this is particularly crucial. We want people to start feeling involved with the state, but we think that that is sort of a political expectation that is better realized on our side of the house. We feel that it is in fact democracy with its very specific processes of choice and decision making and the ability to criticize the government that will make people feel more involved with the state. And besides, we think it's slightly problematic, right, that the government says that, you know, there are certain very tangible economic demands that people have, such as bread, for instance. We do not deny. However, it is also a fact that we all occupy political contexts, and political rights are not really as abstract as they are being made out to be. You know, we think, which is why we think that there are very sort of clear, social benefits to be had out of establishing democracy, to privilege the establishment of democratic institutions, right? Primarily, I mean, we think that when people have the choice to not just sort of agree to what the government is doing, but also to sort of express dissent, to express sort of resistance, to in fact be able to criticize government policies. We think that this is what will increase political engagement, and we believe that by opening up this sort of dialogue, by opening up this sort of tolerance towards difference, we will in fact be producing more self-regulating societies, as our leader of the opposition has already mentioned. We think that even under constrained economic circumstances, it is possible to conceive of communities that are self-regulating, that can then push themselves towards the path of economic advancement that the government wants us to be on, simply by fostering this culture of political engagement, solidarity towards difference. We think that we will be liberating a vast section of sort of groups within the society, right, that are oppressed. For instance, religious and ethnic minorities, LGBT communities, women, for instance. And by doing so, we will in fact be promoting direct economic benefits. For instance, if you are now able to conceive of a situation where a woman has equal rights to employment as a man does, we are in fact liberating a vast section of the community to go out and join the workforce. We think that, for instance, it's particularly crucial that if we are talking about investment and foreign direct investment, especially let's say in countries like Egypt, where tourism is a major industry, we think that foreign direct investment may in fact be increased if you have the notion of a stable democratic government at the center, rather than, you know, a sort of an autocratic or sort of a transitional government that is taking into consideration some economic development. But as our leader has already mentioned, it is severely problematic to assume that people are suddenly going to sort of begin to make the best economic decisions when we are not in fact setting the political context straight. For all these reasons, we're happy to oppose.
Leader of the opposition, and now we summarize the position of the government with James Whitehouse Hepburn from the University of London Union. You crashed it.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think I just want to provide some clarity to this debate, because I think we've been misrepresented on side proposition as somehow wanting some sort of autocratic regime or an authoritarian regime. But this isn't the case, because we think that democracy is great, and ultimately we do want democracy, right? But we think, firstly, democracy occurs better under our mechanism. But secondly, I just want to say that a lot of the stuff that has been talked about in opposition, a lot of the developments which, for example, Shristi talked about in terms of LGBT communities or women's rights can occur under our mechanism, because we don't think economic development and political development always have to be at the expense of one or the other. We think both can happen at the same time. We can have our cake and eat it, so to speak, ladies and gentlemen. We think that ultimately what that means is that there will be certain circumstances where perhaps we should prioritize one over the other. Certain circumstances where maybe there's a clash between economic development and social development. And I want to talk about why we think when those clashes occur, why we should always prioritize economic development over social development. And I'm going to talk about that by kind of providing the philosophical ground or framework for how our side has talked about this. Right? It's about the concept of freedom. Because ultimately, why do we develop any nation? Why do we develop as in North Africa, right, or the Middle East? You develop because ultimately you want to achieve certain things. You develop for democracy because you want civil rights, you want freedoms. You develop economically similarly because it also provides tangible freedoms. But we think, in fact, to some people, the economic freedoms provided by a strong economy are far more tangible and far more beneficial than the things which were provided by a very nebulous and very theoretical rights provided by democratic reform, right? So this phrase has been talked about quite a lot, this idea of bread, dignity, and social justice, right? Like, firstly, we think the fact that bread is the first thing on that list is rather indicative of what people want. But we have to think that, for example, if a man is starving in rural